Hello friends, welcome to A Gentle Healing Journey. My name is Rain Francis, and on this channel I talk about how to deal with life's struggles and challenges. This video is part of my series about why we stay in emotionally abusive relationships. But of course, this could apply to any type of abusive situation. Today, I'm going to talk about the sixth reason why we stay: finances. When we talk about abuse in intimate partner relationships, what normally comes to mind is maybe physical or verbal abuse. We don't often immediately think of financial abuse, but it's very common. And according to Psychology Today, research has shown that 99% of intimate partner violence also involved some form of financial abuse. 99%. I know it happened to me, but not how you might think. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But first, why don't we define financial abuse? Now, put simply, financial abuse means controlling a person's ability to get, use, and keep financial resources. Just like all other forms of abuse, it's about control. It's about controlling your partner so they won't leave you, so that you can treat them any way you want, and you know that they'll tolerate it. In this day and age, trying to control someone by limiting their finances or their ability to get, use, and keep money, it's terrible. Unfortunately, we all need money to survive. Unless you're somebody who is 100% self-sufficient, and congratulations if you are, you need income to keep a roof over your head, to keep food in the fridge, to keep the clothes on your back. We have to pay for medicine, dental procedures, vet visits, gas for the cars. I could go on and on. But my point is that everybody needs money. And knowing that 99% of intimate partner violent cases involved financial abuse, that just shows you how insidious the abusive person can be by limiting their victim's ability to meet their basic needs, without having to beg for money, I should say. Now, I read a story about a woman who was suffering financial abuse along with other forms of abuse in her marriage, and she had to convince her husband to give her money so that her child could go on a field trip at school. I read this in Psychology Today. She was saying that he demanded to see the school flyer, required talking to the teacher to verify that it wasn't his wife who was just trying to get money from him. She said it was terrifying any time she needed to ask her husband for money. A lot of the times he would rage and fly off the handle and make it so difficult that she just wouldn't ask anymore. Now that's very extreme, but I don't think it's all that uncommon. When we think of financial abuse, we think about the situation that I just described. One partner controlling the money while the other has no access to it. But it's so much more. It's more than about controlling the money or giving your partner an allowance. I mentioned something like this in one of my previous videos in this series, that if both partners are okay with this and it works, I don't have an issue with one person controlling the finances and giving the other person an allowance. Now, in my marriage, I was in charge of the finances, but not because I wanted to control everything. It was because he didn't want to have anything to do with it. Plus, all the bills were in my name. This is my house, so the mortgage is in my name. Property taxes are in my name. I own the car. You get the idea. And he showed me over the years that he was irresponsible with money, so I was afraid to trust him to pay things on time when all the bills were in my name. So naturally, I just took over the budgeting, the expenses, and the bill paying. And it worked. He would just send me a certain amount of money at the end of every month after he got paid from social assistance, and he would keep a certain amount for himself. He seemed happy with this arrangement. I don't know if I could use the word happy when I think of the last 4 years we were together, but he was okay with that arrangement. I wasn't necessarily okay with it because we were supposed to be a team. And I really wanted him to show involvement, but he didn't want to be involved, so I took over. I would often try to get him interested by asking him to help me project expenses, household repairs and dreams and upgrades. And I asked him to look at the budget with me, but he didn't want to. And his refusal to be involved with the finances, that led to some financial abuse, and I'm going to discuss this throughout this video. So if we think of other examples of financial abuse, we can think about work. The majority of people need to work for a living, need to work for a paycheck. The abusive partner may try to stop their victim from going to work. They may create drama or start a fight or hide the car keys just as their partner is trying to leave to get to work on time. They may force their partner to miss a day of work. If there are other forms of abuse happening, especially physical abuse, the victim may not want to go into work for fear that the abuse will be obvious. In my case, it was emotional and verbal abuse, so it was invisible for anyone else to see. But it made me physically ill a lot of the times, where I felt so sick that I just couldn't leave the house. It also affected me emotionally in such a bad way that I didn't feel like I could keep it together enough when I was out in public. And of course, all of that abuse led to chronic stress, which basically made me a walking mess. I feel very fortunate that my income was from a disability pension, so that I didn't have to go out and work outside of the house. In hindsight, I don't think I would have been able to be honest. The chronic stress would have led me straight back to burnout over and over. But if someone is a victim of this kind of financial abuse, where the abuser tries to keep them from going to work, or consistently makes them late for work, or worse, harasses them or the other employees at the workplace, this could lead to the person losing their job. So it's not just that the victim loses their source of income, they also lose a reference. If you're let go from your job because you were consistently late or absent, or because your partner creates uncomfortable or dangerous behavior at your workplace, you're probably not likely going to put that employer as a reference for your next job application. Overall, this is very destructive for the person who is going through it, because it basically ensures that it will be difficult for them to find and keep a job so that they can have the money they need coming in to meet their needs. And as I always say, I'm going to be very transparent about my own experience. And as I always say as well, I didn't marry a monster. It wasn't 24/7. Now, I mentioned previously that he wanted nothing to do with the budget, and that it seemed to be okay for both of us. But there was a certain time when it became not okay. We weren't poor, but we were house poor. And that means you can pay all your bills, but there's not much left. But this didn't concern me too much at that time, and I'll tell you why. Now, my husband was much younger than me. When I met him, I was 45 and he was 25. At first, the age difference really kind of scared and concerned me, because I didn't think we would ever have anything in common. But he seemed like an old soul. And when I met him, he was very responsible. He had a job, he had cats, lots of friends, and lots of interests. And I am very much an 80s gal, and he seemed to love all of the 80s music, TV shows, and movies. He loved film noirs from the 30s and the 40s, and he introduced me to those movies, and I got to love them. So as we got to know each other, I realized that, yeah, we did have a lot in common. Plus, we had the same goals in life. We wanted the same things. And we definitely both wanted to be in a long-term relationship and grow old with someone we love. I was always someone who lived up in the mountains or in the woods. I had moved back to the city, to Montreal, where I used to live, where I grew up, to go back to school. But I realized after a certain time that it wasn't really what I wanted. So I had made plans to move back up north. Then I met my husband. So we ended up staying in the city for about the first year or so that we were together. But after a while, I started to really dislike the busyness and the noise of the city living. And I suggested that we move up north together and maybe rent a little house. But that would mean he would have to find a job up north, and he didn't drive. So it was a bit of a conundrum. But after many discussions, we decided to take a chance. He said that he wanted to try to build a business for himself so that he could work for himself. He had some great ideas and he had some amazing contacts. So we agreed that we would find a small house to rent live as frugally as possible on one income, my disability pension, and he would work on his business. And after a year, if his business hadn't taken off, he promised that he would get his license and get a job. But after that year, he hadn't really worked very hard on his business, so there was nothing to show for at that time, and he refused to get a job and his license. He said he didn't think it was fair that he had to go out to work when I didn't. He said that. And I said, but you promised. He denied telling me that he said that. And at some point, we had a lot of debt, So he went on social assistance and he gave me some money every month to cover the excess bills. But I felt trapped, I was always somebody, and I am somebody, who is very proud to pay her bills on time. And I became dependent on that little bit of money that he gave me every month so that I could pay the bills that were in my name. And this was financial abuse. He made promises to get a job, denied saying that, and then refused to work. He also told me that money didn't motivate him. Of course it didn't motivate him. He knew he had it good. He didn't have to work. He could collect welfare, and I would pay all the bills. It was really a trap. The lease was in my name, and I didn't want to break the lease because I was afraid that I would be sued by the landlord. I felt chained to the relationship at that point. Yes, I loved him, but I resented him at the same time. Soon, though, the time came to either break the lease or renew it. And I told him I was breaking the lease and moving out on my own. And this is where he made another promise. He said, look, why don't we find a cheaper place to live? I'll stay on social assistance. You'll have your disability pension. We'll cut down a little more. We'll go fishing every day. We'll spend all of our time together. We'll build a garden. The list went on. He was saying things that were always very appealing to me. Then the clincher. He said, when your disability dries up, it'll be my turn to take care of you. What do you think? Well, what I thought was, this sounds wonderful. I loved him and I didn't want to break up the marriage. I believed him. And I think he was genuine at the time when he proposed that idea. We were able to find a little house for rent that was a lot cheaper than what we had been paying for at that time. So financially speaking, it would have worked out. And we would have been able to get more dogs, which always, sealed the deal for me. So fast forward to the year 2023. We're both living here in Atlantic Canada. I had purchased this home. There were some big emergency bills that had to be paid. My well ran dry, so I had to have a new one drilled, and that is unbelievably expensive. The foundation of the house needed to be fixed. It's a fixer-upper. There were just a lot of little repairs here and there that needed to be done. So I started to really have a lot of debt. And I started to look ahead with the sad realization that our marriage is probably not going to last. At some point in the near future, I felt like we were going to separate. Because quite often, when I asked him to help and follow through on promises that he'd made to me, he would threaten to break up with me and be gone by the end of the month, knowing that all of the expenses would fall on me and that I wouldn't be able to really get by without his contribution. This was another form of coercive control, and again, another form of financial abuse. At that point, I was 55 years old. I had only 10 more years of my disability pension, and I couldn't see how I could save enough money to take care of myself on my own when I lost my pension. And at this point, I still hadn't made the final decision to end the relationship. I was still under the false impression that maybe we'd find a way to be together in our old age, that maybe he'd change. So I brought up the subject. I told him I was getting nervous about the debt and about the future, and that I was so happy that we had made the decision together that he would get a job and contribute to help save for our future, his term. His response was, I never said that. That's never going to happen. He tried to convince me that he told me when we met back in 2013 that he never intended to work again. He was only working to save up enough money for a purchase that he wanted to make, and that he never had any intention of working after he made that purchase. Now, friends, you can imagine that this is complete gaslighting, because I would never get involved with someone who refused to work for a living. We argued back and forth about whether or not he actually said it, but in the end, he told me that he was not going to work another day of his life. And even though this was a shock to me, I think subconsciously I always knew that this was the case. And this was one of the reasons why I made the decision to ask him to move out of my home. But there were other things that he was doing as well. He would forget to send me money at the end of each month. I would have to beg for him to send it to me. And by send, I just mean an e-transfer. We don't deal with cash, right, anymore. But usually at the end of each month, he was giving me the silent treatment after some argument that he would start. So for the longest time, I had to bite my tongue, put on a smile, knock on his door, hoping that he would respond, apologize for the fight, take some more verbal and emotional abuse, and then he would send me the e-transfer. This went on for months. And this is a form of financial abuse, refusing to pay his fair share on time. When I got to a point where I had been frugal enough and I didn't need his contribution anymore, I stopped begging for the money, and he never sent it. There were other things that he would do. He would be rough with things, and when they would break, he wouldn't ever offer to replace them. And it was usually things that were very useful around the house that we needed. So I would be the one to have to replace them. The money that I was being so frugal with that I could put into my savings account, I had to use to replace things. And at one point, the power bill was just so ridiculously high. And I asked him if he would take as many measures as possible to keep his power consumption lower. I was already doing that around the house. And I asked if he could just do the same. He said he would, but he didn't. Again, whenever there was drama or when he was angry with me, he would turn all the lights on in every room. He would blast the heat in every room, even during summer. I remember one morning waking up at about 2 a.m, feeling like I was in a sauna. I got up and I turned all the heat down. This was late summer, so it wasn't that cold out. He had the heat blasting to 30 degrees Celsius. That's 86 Fahrenheit. And at this point, we had separate bedrooms. And I didn't have a door on my bedroom. It was just curtains. He had actually snuck into my room and turned the heat all the way up in my own room while I was sleeping. So I remember getting up and looking around, and I realized that the thermostats were all up to 30 again. I turned them all down to 21, and I went back to bed. He'd been waiting behind his door at that time because as soon as I got back into bed, I heard him get up and he turned them all up again. He would play these games when he was mad at me, and it was basically a way to punish me financially because he knew that I would pay the bills no matter what. Everything was in my name and I was proud to pay my bills. I remember about a week and a half before he took his life, he was playing what I called the heat games, and this was in May of 25. After getting up twice to turn the heat back down, he would turn it up and I just broke down. I asked him to stop torturing me. I was crying. He just stood looking at me and I said, "I don't want to remember you this way." And I went back to bed. And he stopped at that point because he'd broken me. He won. He stopped playing. This behavior was also a form of financial abuse, financial punishment. Okay. Let's talk about other ways that abusers can control the money situation. There could be theft. I watched an interview with a woman, and her husband would steal money from her bank account on a regular basis to go gambling at a casino. Or he would sell her jewelry or things that they owned together that were worth a lot of money. Also, they owned a business together, and he would borrow money against that business without her knowledge. They co-owned their mortgage together, and he would borrow money against the mortgage without her knowledge, forging her signature on the bank loans. In the end, she left him, but she had to declare bankruptcy and she had nothing left. This was devastating to her, and I think she was actually older than I am now when she left him. This doesn't give her too much time to rebuild her finances. But what choice did she have? Maybe one partner overspends on credit cards habitually, knowing that the other partner is responsible for paying the credit card debt. Irresponsibility with money, especially if it's not your own earned money, is a form of abuse. We like to think that when a couple gets married, it's our money, not your money, not my money, our money. And I think in a healthy relationship, we can definitely assume that. Shared responsibilities, shared expenses, shared money. One partner isn't trying to control the other, isn't trying to run up the bills for the other one to pay. These are two responsible people sharing a healthy relationship and healthy finances. But when abuse and coercive control is involved, one person might be trying to punish the other by shooting up the credit card debt. Or like in the example I gave previously, where my late husband tried to run up the power bill, knowing that it was very difficult for me to pay it. I remember a TV show that I watched where there was a couple, this was a long time ago, they owned a business together. One of the partners was filing fraudulent documents to a bank in order to steal money. The other partner would just sign off on it, not realizing what it was, just trusting their partner. And meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of dollars were being embezzled. This is TV, right? At one point, the FBI gets involved and both partners were arrested. I don't think I watched till the end of the series, so I don't know what happened. But this is something that doesn't seem too far-fetched. You know, when we trust our partners, why would it even occur to us that they were trying to screw us over by embezzling money from a bank that could possibly lead to financial and legal disaster for us? Money can be a weapon. One partner controls all of the finances, or they make so much trouble for the other person that they can't keep a job, or they play little games to punish their partners financially. The victim loses their freedom. Victims of financial abuse might not have access to a bank account, transportation, or their basic needs. They may struggle to pay their bills. They may be accused of financial misdoings, or they may have precious items stolen from them. The idea of surviving alone financially feels scary, and they may stay because they just can't afford to leave yet. Family legal services aren't free. If you want to divorce or separate from a common law marriage, there are legal costs. You need a lawyer, and lawyers are not cheap. In my case, I always say my marriage, but we were common law married for 12 years. But common law marriage falls under the same laws as marriage when it comes to separation and divorce. And I'll be honest with you, I stayed much longer than I should have because I was afraid I was going to lose my home and my car. He had the right to sue me for 50% of everything that we had accumulated together during the relationship, even if he didn't contribute financially. And to be honest with you, if we were divorcing or separating on the grounds of irreconcilable differences, as they say, not on the grounds of him being abusive and irresponsible for so many years, I would have been more than willing to share with him and divide our assets. But because of his behavior and his unwillingness to help with the expenses, I was unwilling to lose my home. I bought my house at the age of 53, and I bought this house during COVID when the housing market plummeted. And if I'm completely honest, this is the only reason I could afford to buy a home for myself. And at that time, it was supposed to be a home for us. And I knew that if I had to sell this house to give him half of the proceeds, that was it for me. I would not have been able to ever afford to buy a house in my lifetime. And I was unwilling to do that, so I stayed. And another reason was that the family lawyer wanted a $5,000 cash retainer. None of the family lawyers around here would take credit cards. I didn't have $5,000 in cash, so I was trapped. But I guess in 2025, I made the decision that if I lose my home, I lose my home. I couldn't tolerate it anymore. But for many years, I stayed for fear of being homeless and for fear of being poor. And this isn't a weakness, it's survival with very limited options. Financial control keeps many people trapped, even when they're really desperate to get out and move on. And because I mentioned COVID, I just wanted to say one thing. There have been reports of excessive intimate partner abuse happening during the time when people were quarantined at home. One psychologist referred to it as cruel and unusual punishment for the victim. After everything that I've discussed today, I'm sure you can imagine how financial abuse intensified during the pandemic. Being forced to be with someone 24 hours a day, not being allowed to leave because of the pandemic, this made a lot of victims feel even more trapped, I can imagine. You know, divorce is expensive and it's exhausting. If you can't afford the legal expenses, it makes you feel powerless. Maybe you decided to stay home and take care of the kids while your partner worked. How are you going to support yourself if you divorce? You haven't worked in years. You don't have a resume. You have very little experience. It's frightening, especially if you have kids. The idea of meeting yours and your children's financial needs feels impossible. In these situations, leaving isn't a choice between comfort and hardship. It's a choice between survival and maybe destitution. And as I mentioned in one of my other videos in this series, a friend of mine who was the victim, or who is still the victim, of emotional abuse in her marriage of 30 plus years, she stayed mainly because of the kids. But her kids are grown now and they've moved on. She stays now for her lifestyle. Her husband was a really bigwig in a very big company and they had a wealthy lifestyle. He's retired now, but he has a great pension. She's a lot older than I am and she's convinced that there's no point in her starting over at this point because she enjoys her lifestyle. She stopped working when she had her kids and he gives her an allowance every month. She just avoids her husband at all costs. That's another financial reason why victims stay in abusive relationships, not just for survival, for lifestyle. So my friends, that is the 6th reason why we stay in these abusive relationships, for the finances. What makes financial abuse particularly horrible is that there are no bruises. You can be the victim of years of financial control without ever experiencing any other form of abuse, but you're still trapped. Your credit might be completely destroyed. You may have lost your career. Your savings are gone. You have debt up to your eyeballs. The idea of surviving on your own after this financial devastation, it's terrifying. The fact that you just don't have enough money to hire a good lawyer is just as terrifying. The idea of being homeless or living in poverty is devastating. It just doesn't seem possible to find a way out, so you stay. In my next video in this series that will be coming out next week, I'm going to talk about isolation as a reason why we stay in intimate partner relationships that are abusive. Until then, my friends, thank you so much for watching. Please be well, and I'll see you next time. Bye.